taking you behind the investigation. This is the Arizona's Family Investigates podcast.
The Department of Justice closes its investigation and retracts findings of constitutional violations at Phoenix PD. Welcome to this edition of the Arizona's Family Investigates podcast. I'm Amy Cutler, joined by investigative reporter Morgan Loew and senior producer Cody Lillich. This was a sweeping 3-year-long investigation into Phoenix police, but now the DOJ, at the direction of the Trump administration, is reversing course.
So first, let's talk about the report and its findings. This all started back in 2021, and the Department of Justice looked into 5 areas of concern: use of force, protecting First Amendment rights, the police treatment of the homeless and those with mental health issues, along with racial discrimination.
And we've reported extensively on this, and some of your reporting in particular, Morgan. What did you find out, and why has it gone on for so long, and where did we get to when this has all been rescinded? We
first started looking at Phoenix police use of force policies back in 2018 and 2019. We requested their database of the incidents. Now a lot of this is listed online. Back then it wasn't. So we started compiling the incidents and looking at where these use of force incidents happened more often than not. And we found a trend that in areas of higher minority population and lower socioeconomic status, there were more use of force incidents. So we did some reporting. This came out in the summer of 2020. It was the height of the pandemic. And we were turning stories right and left every day because of the pandemic. Everything was different. So our reporting on this didn't get as much attention as I thought it was going to at the time. A couple of weeks after we did our reporting, the Arizona Republic did a very similar story using the same data that we got. And then things kind of just quieted down for a while. There were some protests, that was Black Lives Matter, and there were some incidents with Phoenix police in the way they dealt with protesters, and some accusations that they were heavy-handed in trying to make protesters appear to be dangerous people or gang members. These were legal protesters. So this sort of went under the radar for a while, and all of a sudden, the Department of Justice came forward and said that they had been looking at these incidents. So we had use of force, who Phoenix police officers were likely to get into physical contacts with or shoot people, the type of people they were having these confrontations with, the way they dealt with protesters. Phoenix, just like tons of other cities, has an issue with homeless population. And the city police department was ordered several times to go in and basically do these homeless sweeps where they clean up the area. We called it the zone, where homeless people were sort of camped out. And they would clean that up. And that was also mentioned by the Department of Justice as having constitutional issues, as well as where homeless people, if they were sleeping on the sidewalk or off the sidewalk in places, they were sort of roused and told to leave. There were some issues that the DOJ picked out about that. And then situations where they're dealing with people with mental health issues. These are all challenges that other police departments faced. Unlike many of the other departments that were looked at by the Department of Justice, there really wasn't one huge issue that stood out here. It was these sort of 5 areas that they looked at that they said stood out and showed that there were problems with the way Phoenix police carried out their mandate of protecting the public safety while also respecting people's civil rights.
I wonder what your reaction was to hearing that the DOJ would be investigating Phoenix PD. You had looked into some of these issues, and then the DOJ comes out and announces this sweeping investigation.
I was, I guess you can't say surprised. We knew that there were complaints about like the way they did the homeless sweeps and that sort of thing. We knew there were complaints and some problems with the First Amendment issues during the protests. And then we were also, probably a little more than others, pretty aware of this problem with confronting people in heavily minority communities, neighborhoods here. And that was probably the one that stood out to me. There were some of the others got some more attention, but that really stood out as, hey, we've looked at the numbers. This is an issue. Now, if you talk to police and you talk to the police, administrators, they have some pretty good explanations for why this happens in some of those areas. And we'll talk about that in a little bit here. But that probably stood out to me as the area that, okay, there's probably something that needs to be looked at here. There is a phrase that's thrown out there that Phoenix police shoot more people than any other police department. I don't know the specific validity of that phrase, but it's they get into a lot of shootings. They get shot at a lot. But that is something that if that happens, you probably want the Department of Justice to take a look and decide, okay, are they following people's civil rights?
Yeah, and you talked about how lengthy this investigation was. The Department of Justice basically embedded themselves within certain sections of the city with legal analysis and also collecting all of these records. They had interviews with police, the police chiefs. We had multiple during that time. They went over just hours and hours of body camera videos, incident reports. It was we heard often how it was a large burden on producing a lot of these documents from the city and the police department for this Department of Justice investigation. And so when all of this was announced in June 2024, the Department of Justice released its report through the Office of Civil Rights. Then the Assistant Attorney General, her name was Kristen Clark, discussed the significance of the announcement.
The findings that we have issued are severe, and I will note that our finding with respect to the treatment of people who are homeless is historic. This is the first time that the Justice Department has issued a finding of this kind in a pattern and practice investigation. It's also only the second time that we have identified discrimination with respect to Native American people. But indeed, the findings are severe.
The Justice Department pushed for what's called a consent decree. That's essentially a binding series of reforms. The implementation is supervised by an independent monitor. City Council would have needed to agree to it, and there wasn't the support for it. We should also note the Police Association pushed back on it, citing the cost, the power it would give that monitor, and arguing it would hurt morale at a time when Phoenix PD was also down a lot of officers. But this decision from the DOJ prompted lots of reaction.
Lots of reaction. And the Phoenix Law Enforcement Association, or PLE, which is the Phoenix, basically, Police Officers Union, has been against this investigation from the beginning. When the DOJ retracted the investigation, police said it was clear vindication for the city and the department. And then meanwhile at City Hall, they had been waiting for this, putting off any possible deal with the DOJ because of the uncertainty that came with the new presidential administration. It was like they were kicking the can down the road, but they'd really made no indication that they had planned to sign on to any consent decree. City leaders reacted to the DOJ retraction, saying mostly that they support the reforms that have already been made by the police department and saying that they have acknowledged that there were problems that have been addressed. Vice Mayor Ann O'Brien shared her reaction with us.
We've had this dark cloud hanging over our head since August of 2021. So couldn't be more thrilled that the DOJ has dropped their investigation and rescinded their report.
What's interesting about the reaction to the DOJ investigation is that, the Justice Department that looked into this was the Biden administration, a Democratic administration. And the city of Phoenix, by and large, is run by Democrats. It's a majority Democrats on the city council, although they don't run as Democrats or Republican. They lean center left. And they were against the DOJ coming in and looking at this. So it sort of seemed like it was Democrats against Democrats. But if you're skeptical of big government reports and big government moves, and you see that there is one party that is divided over an issue like this, it probably makes you want to say, let me take a look at this and see if there is something in here that doesn't make sense or is heavy-handed. So we really took a look at this investigation, and a lot of people looked at the DOJ investigation, and there were problems with it. I don't know if the overall gist of the investigation was flawed. I mean, they documented a lot of issues, but we spotted some mistakes on there that really made you scratch your head. And one of them in particular, one of the issues, when it came to a criticism of the police department and police officers sort of waking up homeless people who were sleeping ostensibly on the sidewalk and saying, you got to get up and move. The examples that they gave in the DOJ report of this happening, the specific examples, two of the big ones that they took quotes from and really sort of showed off in this report, the people were not sleeping on public property. They weren't sleeping on, well, in one case, they were sleeping on not a Central Arizona Project, SRP Canal property. That's not the sidewalk. You know, you can sleep on the sidewalk for the most part. You know, it's a traditional public forum. You're allowed to protest on it. You're allowed to report on it. Generally speaking, you can sleep on it. It's a little different now. There's these anti-camping ordinances that are starting to take off. But at that point, sidewalk, you're allowed to be. Private property, you're not allowed to be. And so they tried to make the point that police were rousing people from an area where they are allowed to be, the sidewalk, but the example they gave was somebody who was sleeping on SRP property, which is private property. And you expect police officers to see someone on the private property and wake them up and get them to move. And there was another example where the person was sleeping in a park, and the park closed after 10 p.m. Whether it's you, me, a homeless person, a kid playing soccer, you're not allowed to be there after 10 p.m. And so it really sort of raised my eyebrow that they would make this well-intentioned point, but use these two examples that didn't back up the point. And there were some other problems like that with the investigation, but critics really latched on to these obvious issues and made the case, tried to make the argument that the entire investigation was flawed. One of the big criticisms that we heard from Plea and the attorneys that represent Plea was that a lot of the interviews with the police officers and the situations were taken out of context. I don't know what that means. I mean, we hear that a lot when people criticize reports, criticize reporting. But that was one of the big problems that they said, is a lot of this stuff was taken out of context.
And the report didn't really provide specifics in terms of like dates and times. So it was really hard going through the report to kind of try to find the specific incident to connect the dots here. So that was a challenging part.
It was a little bit of a head scratcher, because you would think that if you're going to make a report that is going to be this damning, and Kristen Clark used very damning language when she described the Phoenix Police Department, you would think that there would be footnotes and links to the evidence in every one of these sort of criticisms that they laid out. And they really didn't have that. They didn't include that. I'm assuming maybe they were going to save that for court if it went to trial or something like that, or if it became a civil case. But it fed the critics. That lack of detail and transparency really fed the critics.
And while you talked about the reaction coming from City Hall and City Council, while it's been overwhelmingly, the sense has been a relief that there's no federal oversight on the way. And as Ann O'Brien said, the dark cloud isn't hanging over our heads anymore. That's not the sentiment of the whole council. There is one new city council member, Ana Hernandez. She spoke to the Politics Unplugged podcast about the DOJ decision. And I bring this up because she brings a different perspective to this issue. Compared to her colleagues on the council, Hernandez lost her brother in an officer-involved shooting. Here's what she told the podcast.
I mean, I think the mayor and other council members speak from their own experience, and I speak from my lived experience. It's an area that I've been very clear with my colleagues. I understand we are not in agreement, and we don't see this topic as the same, and we may never get to a consensus on this specific issue. But that is part of why I have to continue to talk about it, because their lived experience or their view on this is not the same as mine.
You can listen to more of her conversation with our political editor, Dennis Welch, in our Politics Unplugged podcast.
Now, we also spoke with Ben Taylor, a civil rights attorney. He represented several clients who alleged Phoenix PD used excessive force in their cases. Taylor says he was interviewed by the DOJ as well as some of his clients. This was his reaction to learning about these developments.
The fact that the administration is stopping the investigation is a slap in the face to all the people of color, all the people who are disabled, all the people who are homeless, all the people who have been listed in the DOJ report.
So the investigation is off. There is going to be no push for a consent decree. That is over. What does this mean for the Phoenix Police Department going forward? And Amy, why don't you start with this question?
Yeah, so Phoenix PD says it is already implementing a series of reforms. They point to a new use of force policy, which they opened to get public feedback. They say they're going to be more transparent and accountable. They also point to their Office of Accountability and Transparency, which is reviewing some of these incidents involving force used by officers. They have also implemented some additional training, which they say will make their officers more responsive when they're responding to incidents involving the homeless and those with mental health issues. I know there was a lot of talk prior that those with mental health issues present a lot of challenges for officers. There wasn't a lot of training in terms of the response prior, and Phoenix PD says that they are now changing that.
This was going to potentially be a very long, very expensive process for the Phoenix Police Department. Is there a sense of relief that just, forget about the oversight and the reforms, but just the sort of hassle and expense of this, that's not going to happen now? There has already been a great expense paid on this so far. I believe the total was $3 million, somewhere around that. $13 million, sorry. Broken down by various legal fees, research fees. I mean, there's already been a lot of work that has gone into just assisting the DOJ with anything that they need to get this report done. And also the city had a whole web page designed with their kind of rebuttal to this report when it was released, and also had their own version of the report. Once we had reported on some of those inconsistencies, the city of Phoenix had their own report to come out after the DOJ's report, just to kind of fill in some of the gaps, because it was light on specifics in the DOJ report. So the city of Phoenix attempted to fill in some of those gaps, and that's some of the costs that have already been associated with this. And we'll talk a little bit more about, the heavy costs that could have happened had this gone into effect. So there's already been costs associated with it, and taxpayers are already having to deal with that as the city deals with a budget that's already pretty tight. Yeah, and you guys talked about this just a few minutes ago, but this has gone through a couple of police chiefs, and the city of Phoenix is now looking for a new permanent police chief. Is this going to affect the search for a police chief at all?
You have to imagine that it will. It was interesting because they had gotten pretty far along in the process, and it appeared that the interim police chief, Michael Sullivan, was one of the top contenders. And then it seemed like things might be shifting at the DOJ. Maybe they didn't need to enter an agreement. And part of the appeal to this interim chief had been that he had extensive experience dealing with DOJ investigations. And then suddenly it appears that maybe Phoenix won't have to deal with that. And then they announced that they were restarting their process to find a new chief. So I know that there was some talk that they didn't like. They felt like they could maybe get some more applicants. If the DOJ investigation wasn't a thing, it might appeal to a broader section of people. And so they've restarted this national search once again.
We were in the 11th hour. I mean, we were expecting a decision on a police chief between the 4 candidates. And then all of a sudden the news came in that the interim chief, who had been interim for quite a while, removed himself from consideration, which was just very sudden and came as a surprise to a lot of people. But looking back, it kind of makes sense in the city's view that they are not going to have the DOJ, oversight with their department. And that is what interim Chief Sullivan was most known for, with his work in the Baltimore Police Department, and also before that in Louisville. He wasn't there during the most recent incidents in Louisville, I don't believe, but he's worked with departments that have had reforms before, and that's kind of what he was known for, taking this job as interim. And he did bring reforms. There were, the use of force policy, and I know that you attended the de-escalation training that they had implemented. So he did bring some reform with him during his tenure here. But I think once it was known that DOJ, the oversight, didn't look as promising that it was going to happen, I think that it looks like the city decided, let's restart this search.
Yeah, so relief in the Phoenix Police Department, an opportunity for a new chief to come in with basically a clean slate and not have to worry about this DOJ oversight. But I can't imagine what the reaction must have been like within the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division that's spent all this time, these men and women spent a ton of time looking at the Phoenix Police Department and other police departments. Amy, you actually heard from Kristen Clark about her reaction to this being retracted from her former department.
Yeah, I had reached out to Clark to kind of get her reaction to things. And so we had gone back and forth. I was trying to get her to hop onto a Zoom interview. And then I had later seen that she had actually posted in response to an article about this. And she had some pretty damning words. Let me read them out. To wholesome ignore and disregard systemic police misconduct laid bare in well-documented and detailed public reports shows patent disregard for our federal laws and the Constitution. She clearly believes this is the wrong move. She has been with the DOJ for more than a decade. And I also had the chance to speak with some former DOJ attorneys about this, and there's just a lot of disappointment. They felt like this was sort of the crown jewel of the DOJ, the Civil Rights Division. They had done a lot of important work, and they feel like this shift, this change of direction by the Trump administration is just disappointing, disheartening. There's just, they believe this work was very important and that it was necessary. And now they have concerns about police agencies really making the reforms on their own.
And it's important to point out, Kristen Clark no longer is with the Department of Justice, and but we don't really know the circumstances of her leaving.
We don't. We know that on LinkedIn, on her LinkedIn, she has changed that she is no longer with the DOJ, but she has not listed any other employer at this point.
It's interesting that as soon as President Trump took office, he made it pretty clear that he was going to be backing the blue in many of these situations where there are civil rights issues going on. Several executive orders sort of mentioned that they're going to be taking a look at these consent decrees and that kind of thing. And then this final decision came down, it's like 2 weeks ago, to stop the Phoenix situation. But there are other consent decrees that appear to be going away, and other investigations that appear to be going away. And I would imagine I guess it might be bittersweet for people in police officers here, because there's not a clear sense of why this investigation, why this action is going away. They didn't come forward and say it was all wrong. The Trump administration came in and said, we're not doing this anymore. So I know Plea has come forward and said, we're vindicated. There was no vindication here. It's just that it's going away. So it doesn't really seem like either side in all reality is getting everything they wanted.
True, but they did retract the findings. And I think that is what some of these former DOJ attorneys take issue with, because it would be one thing to just drop it, but to retract it sort of paints the picture that maybe these results weren't valid.
Interesting. Well, you don't have to look far to see some of the challenges that a monitor can present. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office has been under federal oversight for more than a decade, and both of you have spent a lot of time looking into the MCSO monitor and what that's cost the county and what it continues to cost the Sheriff's Department.
Yeah, there's no doubt that this, if it would have gone through, would have been a heavy burden for the city of Phoenix. Just looking at Maricopa County and their budget that they just passed, this has already the federal monitor and associated costs, because this is still an active legal case against the county. So there are legal costs, there are sheriff's office costs, they have to pay for costs associated with the monitor. All of that totaled up from the start of it until now is well over $300 million. Wow. And they still have to budget for this into the next year. So I believe the total is now upwards of $360 million that will projected to be spent. But there's invoices that come in every month that the court approves and the county has to pay. So there's no doubt that this, looking back at Phoenix, would have been a huge cost to bear.
And that monitor, basically former Sheriff Paul Penzone left office citing problems with the monitor.
Yeah, he had said that, he was very proud of some of the changes that he had implemented, and he pointed out that they were really close on the laundry list of items they had to work on. But under this monitor, they have to get to, over 90% in compliance and for a period of time. So there's a lot of resources at a time when he was short deputies and detention officers, and he is still having to put a lot of time and a lot of resources behind coming into compliance. And he had said, when he was leaving office or announcing that he was leaving office, that he felt this was not making the people in the county safer. This was a burden that he was having to deal with that he felt was no longer needed.
Yeah, I think one of his last comments in that press conference was he's not going to take another term with one hand tied behind his back. Basically, that it had hampered his ability to run the sheriff's office effectively because there was so much that was still pending in this oversight, and we monitor the case still, and there are still things that are not completely in the court's mind compliant and the monitor's mind compliant. So this still has a long way to go, and as you said, even when they do get to a stage of compliance, they have to keep that for, I believe it's 2 years. So it's still a long way off and a big cost to Maricopa County.
And that's one of the real criticisms of the monitor program, the setup. And I've heard this from lots of law enforcement officers. In Maricopa County Sheriff's Office is a big sheriff's office. Phoenix Police, it's a big police department. Big organizations like that are going to have problems. and they're going to have some problems that make headlines. And the argument that I've heard from police officers, sheriffs, deputies, sheriffs, is that these organizations are not perfect, but that doesn't mean that there's a systemic problem. It's just magnified because they're just big departments. And their argument was, with the monitor situation, it doesn't seem like there's any room for a realistic big department. Okay, 90%, is that good enough? Is 90% of the time, is that good enough? And the answer apparently was no with the monitor situation.
And there are like 300 items in this that they have to meet compliance on. And a majority of them have been covered because the main priority for this consent decree were the issues under then Sheriff Joe Arpaio and the racial profiling. A majority of the issues have been addressed, but until they all are, you won't see any movement coming from getting out from under this.
So, yeah, that's the next question here is, okay, the Trump administration is getting rid of these consent decrees. Does that have any impact on the monitor overseeing the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office?
And the short answer is we don't think that it will, and that's because the DOJ was signed onto the case, but it was the ACLU that was the plaintiff. And the ACLU is going to continue to fight to have the department come into full compliance. And we just don't see, in being in court and talking to the ACLU, they still have some real issues with the sheriff's office.
Yeah, it's in the city of Phoenix situation, it was the Justice Department that was the driving force. In the sheriff's office, it wasn't the DOJ as the driving force. They just signed on as a party to it. I guess that does make a big difference here.
It makes a huge difference. Basically, now that this has happened, you look at this case and you think, what could happen with Maricopa County's case? And that's the $300 million question with the county. And I know that the chairman of the Board of Supervisors has spoken out, praising the Phoenix decision, but there's not much that can be done on the Maricopa County side because the DOJ is listed as an intervener, and specifically an intervener for the plaintiffs in this case, the ones who were discriminated against under then Sheriff Arpaio. Now, it's conceivable that the DOJ could come in and say, well, we want to be interveners on behalf of the defendants. And so, move sides in the case of who they're intervening on behalf of. That would be Maricopa County and Sheriff now Jerry Sheridan. But as of yet, there have not been any filings on the case that would indicate that. The only filings that we've seen in after the inauguration that have come were basically taking lawyers off the case, which has been reported nationally. There was a large exodus out of the Office of Civil Rights at DOJ because of the changes that are being made. And so the filing that we saw and you reported on, Amy, basically took these people off the case, indicating that they were no longer with the DOJ. So the short answer is, what is ahead for the Maricopa County case? We don't know. But we're definitely going to be keeping a close eye on that docket to see if any filings are made, changing sides to see, who the DOJ supports under this administration.
I also want to mention, because Cody, you've been in court for some of these proceedings. The judge is really involved in this case. He's pretty passionate about seeing this work done. Tell me a little about his tone during some of these hearings.
If I had to describe him, Judge Murray Snow, he is a little bit no nonsense when it comes to this case. I remember writing down at one point, he described this case as a time suck. So kind of animated at times, but definitely wants, people to get the job done. And he wants to see this end, not just end, he wants to see compliance. So he wants both sides to get the work done. He's, there's been, visible frustration on certain things, on how long they have taken to get done. I know that a current sticking point is the compliance of the Professional Standards Bureau, which is MCSO's version of internal affairs. So there has been a little frustration on getting that done. So he set certain number goals that they have to clear a backlog, and so far they have been meeting those. But he's ready to get this off of his docket. So he would love to see it in compliance, and not just, done, but compliance to satisfy both sides.
And what compliance means exactly and when it happens is still the open question here.
And that's up to the monitor and what he sees as compliance. Because every time a quarterly report is filed, you get a report from the monitor, and then you get a report from MCSO basically saying, well, we believe we are X amount % compliant. So, and then I guess the judge sees it somewhere in the middle, but you have the government's angle of aligning mostly with the monitor. Occasionally you do see the ACLU and the DOJ disagree on certain points with the monitor, but overall it's the monitor's assessment on what is compliant.
Wow. Well, we'll continue to follow this closely because there are still a lot of developments to happen there. Morgan and Cody, thank you so much for joining us. And this has been an Arizona's Family Investigates podcast.
The Arizona's Family Investigates podcast, hosted by Amy Cutler and produced by Cody Lillich, and a production of Arizona's Family 3 TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.